Thank you for attending today. My name is Myra Wick. I'm with the Departments of OBGYN and Clinical Genomics at the Mayo Clinic. I will be talking about genetic testing and cancer. What is genetic testing? Genetic testing examines our genes for changes or mutations, and it's important to note that in our current terminology, we refer to mutations as a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in our genetic material. Genes are made of DNA. This is a DNA strand. A gene is just a small segment of a DNA strand. Genes are present in almost all cells of our body, including our white blood cells in our bloodstream. Genes are contained in structures called chromosomes, shown in the picture here, and each chromosome contains thousands of genes. Most humans have a total of 46 chromosomes and a total of approximately 22,000 genes. We have 2 copies of most genes, one from each of our parents. The exception is in males who have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. Males have only 1 copy of genes contained on those 2 chromosomes. There are actually 2 types of genetic testing that I'm going to talk about today, both germline testing and somatic testing. And the diagram here and the chart give us more information about those types of testing. Germline mutations are changes that are present in almost all of the cells of our body, including in our eggs or in our sperm if we're a male. These are inherited or can be passed down from parent to child through the egg or sperm. And these are the mutations that cause hereditary cancer syndromes that we see in families. Somatic changes are not present in all cells of our body. They're only present in certain cells, such as a tumor. They are not present in our germline, so they are not inherited, and we usually see these kinds of mutations occurring in a person later in life rather than something that they're born with. This chart gives us further information. Somatic testing, again, is looking for changes in DNA, such as in tumor DNA. These changes are not hereditary or passed on from one family member to another, and they can be found by testing the tumor, and we'll talk more about that towards the end of my talk today. Germline testing is looking for changes that are present in all cells of the body, including egg or sperm. These changes are hereditary and can be passed on from one family member to another. And we can actually find these changes by looking in a blood sample by testing the DNA in a white blood cell. I think it's important to remember, and many patients are surprised by the fact, that most cancer is not hereditary. If we look at this pie chart here, the white is representing the percentage of cases that are not hereditary. The red is representing those cases that are hereditary. For breast cancer, approximately 15% of cases of breast cancer are hereditary, and with ovarian cancer, approximately 15 to 20% of cases are hereditary or passed down from one generation to the next. When we look at the genes that are involved in hereditary breast cancer, BRCA1 and 2 account for the vast majority of hereditary breast cancers. This little light blue piece of the pie here represents other genes, and we'll also talk about those. With regard to ovarian cancer, BRCA1 and 2 again account for the majority of hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, with the Lynch syndrome genes accounting for another 10%, and a handful of other genes accounting for another 1%. And we'll talk about those genes briefly as well. Because BRCA1 and 2 account for the majority of hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, people are more familiar with BRCA1 and 2, and we've also been helped out a little bit by the media. If you have heard of Angelina Jolie or Gilda Radner, both Angelina and Gilda Radner had hereditary breast and ovarian cancer due to BRCA1 or 2 mutations that were passed down from a family member. In the case of Angelina Jolie, this is her pedigree. She is shown by this individual here with the arrow, and she inherited a BRCA1 mutation from her mother, who had inherited from Angelina's grandmother. Because she was aware that she had a BRCA1 mutation, she was able to undergo prophylactic surgery and significantly reduce her risk for developing breast or ovarian cancer. This graph shows some of the cancer risks associated with BRCA1 and 2 mutations. On the left, we see breast cancer risk for patients who carry both, or who carry either a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, is on the order of approximately 70% lifetime risk. That compares to the population risk of about 12%. Ovarian cancer risk is also significantly elevated. Ovarian cancer risk in the general population is about 1.5 to 2%. In individuals with a BRCA2 mutation, that risk is about 15 to 25%, and even higher in individuals with BRCA1 mutations. Other elevated risks include male breast cancer and prostate cancer in males who carry a BRCA1 or 2 mutation. So we don't want to forget about the males in our family, because they are also at risk for cancer, and they are also at risk for passing the mutation on to subsequent generations. In the previous pie chart, I showed you that there are other genes involved besides BRCA1 and 2. BRCA1 and 2, again, are shown here, and these are all of the different genes that we're aware of which might be involved in ovarian cancer. So again, BRCA1 and 2 account for the majority of those genes, but there are several other genes that have been identified. And I won't go through all of the names of these genes, but it's important to know that mutations in other genes other than BRCA1 and 2 can be associated with a hereditary cancer syndrome, which looks very similar to that syndromes that are caused by mutations or variants in BRCA1 or 2. Why is that? Well, in the cell, BRCA1 and 2 gene products have very specific functions in controlling the cell cycle. There are lots of other gene products in the cell that interact with BRCA1 and 2, and so you might imagine that if you had a mutation in one of the genes that interact with BRCA1 or 2 in the cellular level, that you might have a clinical picture which appears very, very similar to a syndrome or to a hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome where there's a mutation in either BRCA1 or 2. At the same time that we were learning more about genes involved in hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, we were making great strides and great accomplishments in the laboratory through the invention of something called next-generation sequencing. This is automated sequencing in the laboratory, which allows us to very rapidly and efficiently analyze multiple genes simultaneously. And this picture is just illustrating what that might be perceived as, if you will, in the laboratory setting. This is much faster than what we did back in the 90s, where we had to do everything manually. So this has given us a capacity to look at many, many genes very, very rapidly and very cost effectively as well. Because of this, many laboratories, many commercial laboratories and academic laboratories are now offering hereditary cancer panel analysis. 10 years ago, if a patient had come in with with what appeared to be a hereditary breast or a hereditary ovarian cancer, we would have basically offered her testing only for BRCA1 and BRCA2. Because we know that there could be other genes involved in a hereditary cancer syndrome, and because of those advances in technology, we're now able to offer patients panel testing, where we will simultaneously test for multiple genes which may be involved in hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. And this is just an example from one commercial laboratory of the types of panels that are available. So you can see we still have the option to test just for BRCA1 and 2, but we also have the option of looking at many, many other genes at the same time. And this allows us to get more information with a single test. Why might we consider cancer panel testing? Well, there are a couple of reasons. There are several different cancers which might be explained by a variety of different hereditary cancer syndromes. So, for example, breast cancer could be explained by hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, which is due to a mutation in either BRCA1 or 2. But there are other hereditary cancer syndromes that also have breast cancer as a feature, including Cowden syndrome, Li-Fraumeni syndrome, Poitz-Jeghers syndrome. Similarly, ovarian cancer, again, most often associated with BRCA1 or 2, but there are several other hereditary cancer syndromes which may also include ovarian cancer. So this overlap in syndromes and cancer types is one reason why we might consider offering panel testing. There are some advantages and disadvantages of panel testing, and again, we're talking about hereditary cancer panel testing. The advantages, as I've alluded to, is that it's more time and cost effective than doing one gene test, coming up with a negative test result, and then reflexing to a second gene test. It gives us more comprehensive information. And some laboratories are actually offering familial testing to family members without any charge. So if we find a mutation for a patient, the patient's first-degree family members, which are her children, her siblings, and her parents, are at 50% risk. And some laboratories will actually offer testing for that mutation to family members free of charge. There are also some disadvantages of panel testing. Sometimes we have an unanticipated finding. For example, we find a mutation in a gene which is associated with cancers that might not have been observed in that family, and we weren't really expecting that test result. Some of the genes that are included on the panels, we really don't know all of the information about the cancer-related risk. And so for some of the genes included on the panels, we don't have guidelines for what we need to do for screening and surveillance. And so we may need to kind of make up those recommendations for screening and surveillance so that we're able to keep the patient as healthy as possible. There's also the disadvantage of an equivocal test result, or what geneticists refer to as variants of uncertain significance, or VUS. These are changes in the DNA sequence that the laboratory cannot be absolutely certain of how to interpret, despite following all the interpretive rules that we have through the American College of Medical Genetics. We find these equivocal results in approximately 30% of individuals tested, and we treat these results essentially as a normal result, but sometimes it can cause anxiety in patients if they have an equivocal result. Why is hereditary cancer testing important? Well, it allows us to know about an individual's personal cancer risks. So, for example, if we know that an individual has a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, we are going to make recommendations about surveillance for breast and ovarian cancer, and we are also going to make recommendations about prophylactic surgery. As I mentioned earlier, it also allows us to assess familial risks. First-degree relatives are at 50% risk for inheriting a hereditary cancer syndrome. And so if we are able to test the family members and have an idea of their risk, we can also recommend screening and surveillance to family members. And finally, cancer treatment. We know that certain chemotherapeutic agents, such as PARP inhibitors, may be more efficacious if a patient has a BRCA1 or 2 mutation. And I'm going to let my colleague, Dr. Warner Hendrickson, talk more about that in her session. Well, we've talked a lot about hereditary cancer testing, or testing for mutations that were passed on, but we can also test a tumor for somatic or acquired mutations. So these are mutations that were acquired by the tumor, but were not inherited. They were not passed down, and the patient does not have these in their germline. And that is illustrated by these figures here, and I won't go into detail. But cancers are notorious for acquiring mutations over time, and that's shown in this diagram on the right-hand side, where you have a cell that acquires one mutation, and then a second, and then a third, etc. And it's important to know about these mutations as well, because we know that patients who have an acquired mutation in their tumor may actually respond better to certain chemotherapeutic agents as well. And so your provider may talk to you about doing germline testing, but they also may talk to you about tumor testing. So ideally, we are offering our patients both germline and tumor testing, and these results might not actually be identical. And so that information from both the germline testing and the tumor testing can be used in some cases to help decide upon chemotherapeutic agents for patients. Well, with that, I'm going to wrap up. I'd be happy to take any questions later. These are just some different views from the Mayo campus. This is a Plummer building, which was lit up for the 4th of July. This is an early spring picture with the tulips beautifully blooming. And then our current situation where we have some of our windows decorated for COVID. Again, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.